It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Ron Dart, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective. Ron, welcome to the show.
Oh, great to be here.
Well, Ron, you are brand new to me in this conversation, and I know that you're going to be new to some of the listeners, some of the viewers. So let's start off our talk today with a bit of what we might call the Ron Dart origin story. So for all of us encountering you for the first time, what are a few things we need to know about you?
Well, I live in British Columbia in Canada, which some of you Americans would know, or on the west coast of Canada. I've taught at University of the Fraser Valley for about 30 years in the areas of political science, philosophy, and religious studies. My recently published book before the Jordan Peterson was on Hermann Hesse, one of the great counterculture literary figures of the 50s, 60s, and 70s, one of the few European writers who had a profound impact on the North American audience. And so I published about 40 books, and this most recent one on Jordan Peterson, Myth and Meaning, is just the next in a series of planes leaving the tarmac.
Yes, I've had authors tell me that if they're very prolific, they've always got a bunch of horses in the stable that they're building up, and they send them off one by one as they're ready to go out into the world.
Yes, indeed. It's like being in a hangar constructing a plane, and then you get the thing off the hangar, and then another one's in the process of being created, thought through, and off that bird goes.
Well, in terms of your educational background and the teaching you've done, has there been any particular area of focus or specialization? Like, where have you spent the bulk of your time?
Well, one of the areas that's very much interested me is the relationship between spirituality, religion, politics, culture, literature, a very integrated outlook. And then I've also been very interested in the difference between historic Canadian high Toryism and what some people call conservatism, which would be republicanism in the States or our own Conservative Party in Canada. And sometimes these terms are equated, and they're quite different given the Anglo-Canadian experience and the Anglo-American experience. And so it's I have a variety of interests, anywhere from the split between spirituality and religion and different understandings of spirituality and who defines it. And then as you move out from that into the larger public, political citizen questions, and particularly in the midst of our culture wars and the fragmentation and polarization which so besets so much this day, and ways of overcoming that tribalism in a more ironical approach.
And in terms of Jordan Peterson, I'm curious because you're in Canada, I'm here in the States. When did you first become aware of him? And then when did he first pop on your radar as far as kind of his rise to prominence? Because before recently, he was relatively unknown.
Well, it's in many ways the same in Canada. I've been interested in him since the 1990s, and particularly his big tome, Maps of Meaning, which is a little more sophisticated and subtle work on the exploration of issues of meaning and how do we make sense of meaning and the different bypaths people take in the quest for purpose, meaning, fulfillment, call it what you will. But at that point, he was still relatively unknown, mostly speaking to an academic audience. He increasingly in Ontario, which is a province in central Canada, he increasingly became quite vocal as the hot button issues accelerated in the first decade of the 21st century, but still mostly focused in the Ontario northeastern part. But it was with 216 that he really is catapulted onto the national stage with the forced speech issue and the position he took. And then, of course, as a result of Autumn 216 forward, he's been very much the man of the moment. He's been traveling throughout North America, Europe, and other places, articulating his concerns with the drift to an element of an ideological progressivism that just does not in any way engage anything that differs with their perspective, and then becomes very much a culture of animosity and conflict and polarization. And so really, in terms of his more pronounced public front stage role, it's really been since 216, But back of that, there is also a decades-long history of almost a Kierkegaardian struggle to make sense of the quest for meaning in a secular age which wants to deny spirituality or elements of religion. And so there's integrity in his quest. It's taken him in different directions. But as I mentioned, 216.4 would be the second big phase of Peterson's journey. And so so my students by 216 I've probably had more students who've become interested in Christianity through Jordan Peterson than any other thinker I have dealt with. And so, I mean, we can study these great thinkers in the past, great philosophers, political theorists, theologians, philosophers, but here's a living embodiment of someone grappling with the big epic issues of the human soul and society. And so my students, particularly many, are disoriented and not quite knowing what choices to make for a good and meaningful life. They have found in Peterson someone who has been a guide, a mentor on the journey, and as they've tried to think through that reality, their own lives have in many ways gone a little deeper. And some of the authors in the book are former students of mine.
And in terms of the story behind this book, the story behind this project, what set you down the path or initiated you into becoming the editor for this Jordan Peterson theme project?
Yeah, there were 2 or 3 reasons. I found the reception to Jordan Peterson, you either had people who were demonizing him on the progressive or trendy left, sort of the orthodoxy of liberalism, or bordering on a fundamentalism, a certain type of liberalism. And then you had other people genuflecting toward him uncritically, as if he was the messiah for the new age that was going to save civilization, which is equally silly. So I was very interested in bringing together people in which we would try and understand rather than demonize or genuflect. And there had been no books out yet on Peterson in terms of his interest in Christianity. And so I brought together the various books that have been done on Peterson have mostly been single author books. And I was interested in a variety of perspectives from different angles on Peterson that dealt with secularism and religion, the culture wars, neo-Marxism, politically correct, and postmodernism, different ways, his approach to the Bible, his lectures on Genesis and Exodus, as I mentioned earlier, many of my students who've either grown up totally secular and with the Bible as a dated text that nobody in their right mind would read, or a simplistic literalism. Peterson's approaching the text in a way that's very existential and speaks to perennial themes of the human soul and the human journey. And this way, he makes the Bible, as far as he's gone in Genesis and Exodus, a living and very much addresses students in their all too human questions. So I would say bringing a variety of people together, bringing a bit of the Christian perspective, approaching it from a diversity of angles, and trying to transcend the tribalism of the genuflectors and the demonizers.
And in terms of the contributors to the project, who are some of the people you partnered with?
Well, I mean, I started off with the introduction, and then my article was on myth and memoricide, because one of I would see as the sort of overriding dilemmas of our time is memoricide or no memory. So many people just lack any grounding in anything. It's like all the markings have disappeared. And so I did that. Then I had a couple of my students, one who actually became very interested in the Bible through Peterson, and he watched many of his lectures on Genesis and Exodus, and it actually drew him back to Christianity. Another one of my students who did his studies in classics, he was quite interested in Peterson's more allegorical or typological approach to the Bible, just not the literal, grammatical, historical. Didn't negate that, but also said there's great themes in the Bible that transcend a simple literal grammatical tradition, which is how the early church understood it from about the 2nd to the 7th centuries, what's called the patristic era. Then I had authors that were very interested in the secularism, particularly a hard or aggressive secularism, which tends to negate the religious longings, the spiritual hunger of our time, and how Peterson is trying to bring together the best of a scientific world view. He's trained as a psychologist, grounded in people like Carl Jung and Newman, and so he's blending the best of science with the best of spirituality and religion, and mining the mother lode of these great classical texts of the West and making them existentially relevant for people. So that secular religious issue, Esther O'Reilly did something on Peterson and humanism, because within certain forms of Christianity, secular humanism or humanism is a nasty word, whereas in the Christian tradition, humanism a very noble word, because in the faith we embody the very best of what it means to be human in terms of trying to make sense of our life, our journey, good citizenships, the life in the church and the world. So her article looks at the Peterson's understanding of what it means to live a genuinely and meaningful human life at its very best and noblest and most attractive in that sense. One of a friend I taught with, he looked at Kierkegaard and Peterson, the sort of agonized journey of Kierkegaard trying to make sense of his own life and relationship of that to the Lutheranism of Denmark at the time. So that looks at the relationship of Kierkegaard and Jordan Peterson. And so there's a variety of articles in which we've tried to sort of look at different pathways into the center of the core of Peterson's concerns. And each of the authors, given their particular interests and concerns, have approached it, I think, well, wisely, thoughtfully, in a very articulate and literary manner.
Well, in terms of Peterson's rise to prominence within culture, I mean, clearly he taps into some kind of a gap or a felt need. I mean, if you had to put words to it, what is that place in culture that Peterson's messages fit right into? Where did he strike a chord?
Yeah, that's an ongoing interest for us as well as the book. I think what has happened culturally in the last few decades is there is a form of liberalism has gone in two directions, which don't speak to a lot of people. One is the tradition of liberalism that all is perspectives. And it's a postmodern, post-structuralist approach. There is no guidance anymore. We just all look at life in our own private way, and nothing's right, nothing's wrong. It's just your perspective is different than mine, and nothing is right or wrong. That leaves people bereft of any roadmap for meaning. And this is where you have people, I think, feel quite alienated and disoriented in how to live their life. The flip side, and it's a reaction to this lack of minimal orientational liberalism, is the politically correct liberals and the social justice warriors, and this is how you're to line up. The problem of that, of course, it distorts reality. Life is more complex than reducing it to simple Betty Crocker formulas. So he speaks to the lack of depth in both those two wings of liberalism, that if people have gone to universities or if they're minimally exposed to the broader culture, that's what they're going to be revealed to them. The other is almost a hyper reaction of a form of conservatism, which is what it shares with the politically correct liberalism, is we know what's absolutely right, and if you don't line up or goose step behind our ideological agenda, then you're not quite on the ship that's sailing where it should be across the water of time. So there's three areas that I think Peterson is dealing with, and it for people who can't buy into any of those three perspectives, he's saying there is another way. There is another way to approach this historically, culturally, psychologically, mythically, religiously, spirituality. And in that sense, he's spoken to a generation of women and men that are hungering for something a little deeper, but because of the problem of memoricide, they don't know where to go to find it. And this is the great dilemma I find with many of my students, is this lack of, we all know if we went to bed at night and we woke up in the morning and our memory was gone, we wouldn't know how to orient. Well, the same with culture. if people have no memory of where they come from or their history, then how do they orient culturally and economically and educationally and religiously? And so he's really recovering memory in that sense, in a thoughtful, sensitive way. And he's been pilloried by both sides, and he's too nimble and subtle a thinker to slip into the orthodoxy. And so if you're on the sort of the orthodox left, and he's seen as a heretic or heterodox. If you're on the right, he's seen as too liberal. And it's the mark of any thoughtful person is they cannot be easily, as Shakespeare would say, cabin cribbed and confined into sort of a simplistic formulaic approach to life. And so I think that's the gap he's filling in culture. Whether he's doing it as well and as wisely and as deep and as sophisticated, he's good. I tend to see him as a portal thinker. He's pointing to deeper thinkers, whether it's Nietzsche or whether it's Dostoevsky or whether it's Kierkegaard or whether it's Carl Jung or whether it's Bible or whether it's other great religious traditions, the myths that they embody in their great epics. So he's saying there is a story, there's a narrative, a meta-narrative that if we ignore, it leaves our soul bereft in the quest for meaning. I don't know, does that sort of make minimal sense?
No, that was perfect. That makes total sense. You'd mentioned a little bit ago that both in terms of students, both men and women have been impacted, but it seems that young men in particular have really resonated with a lot of Jordan Peterson's messages. So would love to just get your thoughts and commentary on why younger men, and I mean, honestly, younger men can be even from teenagers into people into their 30s at this point, I think could be the range. But why did that kind of male, younger demographic really connect with Peterson in a big way?
Well, I think there's a few reasons sociologically for that, but I think one would be in a sort of, there's a certain form of feminism. Obviously, not all forms of feminism fall into this, but there's a certain form of feminism that sees males and patriarchy as the problem. And the further you go down that extreme feminist route, it demoralizes, it castrates men. It makes them feel that they historically have been the bullies, that have been the oppressors, the women have been the victims, and it gives them a sense that who am I? What's worth doing? And so what Peterson does, he empowers them to basically say, perhaps this read of male, female in a certain read, because there's a very healthy forms of feminism also. But there's a certain read that you'll get at universities, that you'll get in cultures, certain forms of publications. It's what's been called neo-Marxism, in which you have the oppressor and the oppressed. Again, it's a simple little formula which distorts the complex nature of reality in this area. But if a person buys into that hermeneutic or that way of interpreting, and the females have been the oppressed, the males have been the oppressors, you flip that on its head, and then males can feel very, very much beat up, paralyzed. And so what Peterson does is he comes along and says, this whole read of the male-female history is highly problematic. And so it's a way of empowering men to get on their own feet again and say, let's move forward on this much more thoughtfully. And also, because of his strong sense of human responsibility and acting and choice and willing, there's also a certain type of male that slipped into pacifism and can blame parents, it can blame family, it can blame culture, it can slip into cynicism and skepticism. There's nothing can be done. The state is terrible, education's terrible, religion's terrible. So you go, and this leads to a total impotence as a male. Peterson comes along in this particular approach too and says, cynicism and skepticism or nihilism is a dead end. This is why he's explored Nietzsche so deeply. It's a cul-de-sac. It takes you to the cliff edge, and it's time to wake up from this sort of impotence. So I think he also speaks to that broader cultural cynicism, nihilism, and he basically argues through myth and stories that each and all perhaps, and many have had difficult experiences, painful experiences, but that need not paralyze you for life's journey. The task is to overcome those issues and move forward using your freedom and responsibility and accountability. So I would say this was a second issue as well, and I think men have responded to that. What do you think?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the people in my circles that have talked to me most about Jordan Peterson and their impact, the impact that they felt from his book, definitely it's my male friends more so than my female friends that have really resonated with what Jordan has had to say. In terms of what you cover in the chapters of the book, what good has Jordan Peterson contributed to, say, public discourse or public discussion? Because on the one hand, you've got people who vilify him and hate him, and others who have, on the other extreme, kind of seen him as this modern messiah. If we have a kind of a balanced approach, what are the good things that he's brought into public discussion right now?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think he's assisted people in thinking through two variations of liberalism. The relativist approach, and the other hand, a very brittle ideological approach of the social justice warriors and the politically correct approach. The other hand, he's thoughtful enough to say, be wary of a certain type of reactionary conservatism. That's danger. And so he has fulfilled a role on the public stage that many people have thought, but ne'er so well expressed. And he's been willing to go into the lion's den on these issues. And of course, he's been shot at for doing so from both sides. So the right picked him up initially as the left again and again turned on him, whether it was major media or publications or educational institutions. So the right thought he was with them, but then he is very quick to say, be careful of slipping into your own ideology also, because at the heart of Peterson's thinking is there are deeper truths at work that cannot easily be reduced to formulas, to simple little categories. So I think his strength is he's exposed, the emperor has no clothes on two types of liberalism and reactionary conservatism. He's offered an alternate way to think, and in that sense, he's a finger pointing to the moon. Now, in the old Zen parable, some people keep looking at the finger, not the moon, and in that sense, they miss the message. So he's a portal thinker that points in a certain direction, and in that sense, he's contributed to a more meaningful public discourse. Now, he, again, as I mentioned, should not be seen as the final answer, and sometimes the means by which he speaks can be a bit aggressive, can be a bit confrontational, punchy in that sense, cannons loaded. And so often the method, the way he comes across, confirms for people he's a reactionary on the right. And I think sometimes the categories that he sometimes too easily can slip into simplistic categories like neo-Marxism and postmodernism. And some of these are a little more complex when understood in a more sophisticated way. So, but the dilemma always, when you've only got 2 minutes or 5 minutes, you slip into crude generalizations, which inevitably distort more complex realities. And then, of course, his recent book, the 12 Rules for Life, it's some people of a more sophisticated nature feel it's almost comic bookish, but it's important. It's a bit like reading Erasmus of the 16th century. He can write very sophisticated works, but then he does his adages, simple little parables. Tolstoy, exactly the same, very sophisticated novels, but he tells his children's stories. A lot of it depends on the audience you're addressing, and Peterson has tried, as any educator, to address a wide range of audiences in that sense. And so his 12 Rules for Life, if you look at it from one perspective, yes, it's a bit simplistic, but who's it addressing? That's always, I think, any reader or critic should be asking yourself, who is the audience that this book is addressing? If you want more sophisticated Peterson, well, read Maps of Meaning. Whether you agree with it or not, it's more sophisticated. And so that 12 Rules for Life will be... it's being republished again quite shortly, but he's received a barrage of both hate mail almost because of that, or opposition, but also other people have got on the horse and wrote it, and they found it very helpful. And I mean, I've had students, that book and others, that said they've saved my life. So, I mean, even if the book saves one person's life, much less I know it's helped many other people, it's to their credit. And then hopefully they begin to think more critically about themselves, the books, and life, and they move on from there. So it's not the end destination. It's a station stop on the journey. And if people can see Peterson as a station stop, and everyone has different temperaments, they're coming from different backgrounds, and they're all thoughtful people or minimally thoughtful, are trying to make sense of their journey, where it can be quite confusing. And Peterson, you can get off the train and stop at the Peterson Railway and, sort things out and then move on, hopefully. He's not the final word. And for some people, they make him the final word. Does that sort of make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Would love to, I guess, ask you kind of the opposite question in terms of things that we need to be concerned about, blind spots or overreactions. I mean, I understand what you said a few moments ago in terms of the format of debate and places he is often seen speaking. There's a time limitation that kind of makes some interesting challenges for the depth that you can actually communicate when you have a soundbite or a minute or 2 minutes. But I guess I would frame this more from the perspective of the Christian reader or the Christian viewer or listener encountering his material. Any blind spots or overreactions they just need to be wary of or aware of as they're consuming what Peterson has to share?
Well, I would say from a Christian perspective, a lot depends where a person's coming from. So if a person's coming from a distinctly Protestant Reformed tradition, they don't quite know what to do with his mythic read of the Bible, because they're coming from more a 16th century literal, grammatical, historic, textual read grounded in history. And it's not that Peterson's against that, but his question is, okay, so that's historical, but what's that got to do with us today? And how does it speak to our soul? And this is how the mothers and fathers of the church from the 2nd to the 7th century grounded these issues. So with one of my classes I'm doing is with Augustine's great work, The City of God. We're just using this book for the semester. Now, Augustine looks at, 6 forms of interpreting any text. And so what's happened in certain forms of Protestantism, it gets reduced to one. But if you're coming from that Reformed tradition, a certain form of evangelical Reformed tradition, then it's, what is he doing? And this is not how you exegete the text. This is slipping into fantasy world. Peterson is coming from a psychological perspective. And then he's looking at the role of how do you approach a text so it speaks to a person's soul in their all too human journey, not just, well, this is interesting, it happened in the past, but what does it mean for us in our journey in the present, and how are we to be transformed? And what's the role of the text, the Bible in this case, in a deeper inner understanding in the transformation, facing our shadows, our dark side, what Christians would call the sinful side, in that sense. And obviously, again, if a person comes from a tradition that the Bible is their authority, it's infallible and inspired and inerrant, then the question is, what do we mean by that? Again, Peterson, for some, he's not as clear for many of them on that. In that sense, he's a little more Catholic in his understanding of what is the relationship of text or tradition, how did text come into being, but more importantly, what's the existential relevance of the text. In that sense, even though he doesn't come across it, he's very pastoral in that sense. He's interested in people making sense of their lives and the role of the Bible in assisting them in the doing of that. So as a psychologist, many people who go into counseling have pastoral bents to them. And in an age in which the Bible has been sidelined by a certain form of hard secularism, he's trying to bring it back onto the public stage. And interestingly, in his lectures in Toronto, one of our more cosmopolitan cities in Canada, where you think anybody with an education is not going to go study the Bible in public forums, he packed out the areas where and it was like, what is going on here? So there's obviously a hunger. But I think, a lot of it depends on how a person understands their faith, how they understand how you interpret the Bible, apply the Bible, make it meaningful in life journey. Some are going to find him not creedally and confessionally exact to suit their interest. And so to me, when people are asking the questions about Christianity, a lot of it depends their own understanding of Christianity, and they're either going to be drawn to Peterson. You get a lot of post-evangelical, postmodern Christians which are very drawn to Peterson. So it much hinges when a person talks about Christianity, what form or what interpretation, because it's like a rabbit. Christianity is like a rabbit; it runs in all directions. And you have certain forms of Republican Christianity, certain forms of liberal Christianity, different understandings of the Bible, how it applies personally, ecclesially, socially, economically. All these, I don't know. That's an answer that I could go on with, and I know you have to end this soon.
Almost time for us to wrap up, but no, like all of your answers today, another fantastic response. In terms of the reader's journey with this book, I'm curious from your perspective as kind of the editor or project manager, whatever you want to say your hat was on this project. Like, how do you hope that somebody has been impacted or challenged when they get to that last page, they close that back flap? How do you hope that they've been shifted or changed along the journey?
Well, I would say first, I hope the book speaks to them on their journey and some of their questions. I hope it challenges them to go a little deeper with some of their questions. I hope it leads them to go beyond Peterson in some of their questions as well. But as I mentioned, for many, he's a station stop on the journey. He's a very helpful, as it were, pastoral guide for them. They should never absolutize him, as you shouldn't anyone, or turn him into an icon, because icons do break. And if icons become idols, you've got real problems. But see him as and the book in that sense it's because it's so multidisciplinary. It's sort of messages. You can approach Peterson as we can approach our own journeys in a variety of ways. And so depending on the questions that are deepest to a person's heart and soul and mind, I think different chapters will speak to them. Some are very biblically oriented, some are dealing with secularism, religion, some with the humanism, some with the trendy issues and the culture wars, mine with memoricide. So what happens when people have no memory of any substance anymore? What happens to them culturally, personally? So I think, as I said earlier, people are at different places of their journey. And I hope different chapters will speak to different people, depending on where they are. Or hopefully it'll cause them to maybe see Peterson in a way that they don't simplify him to feed into their agenda. And hopefully at the end of the day, it takes them to much deeper thinkers in terms of where we're moving culturally and where history is going and how some of these difficult issues divide people. And are there women and men that can thoughtfully transcend some of these tribes and clans and not isolate themselves on little islands, but can be bridge builders? I think that's perhaps something Peterson could work on as he moves forward, being more of my roots are more people like Erasmus and Hermann Hesse, who I did the book on. These are bridge builders. And of course, often when you're building bridges, you get shot at from all sides because you're not part of the tribe and you're seen as a Judas to the tribe. But I think that's something, because Peterson sometimes can come across a little confrontational, a bit like Rams and Rutting season, very similar to the Luther-Erasmus debate of the 16th century. Luther was very much a charger, confrontational person, whereas Erasmus was always trying to find points of convergence rather than points of divergence. So I think people will find different things helpful, but hopefully they will find it encouraging, helpful, meaningful on their journey.
Well, and like many people in my age demographic, I've listened to a lot of Jordan's talks. I've spent time in both of his books. And, from my perspective, this is a helpful and a thoughtful read. It challenged some of the things I had been thinking, and really just, I felt like it helped me to explore some side themes related to Jordan Peterson and his ideas that I just never, ever thought to go down those rabbit trails before. So if you're a fan of all things Jordan Peterson, I think this would be a great companion book to have alongside and just really spend the time thinking and wrestling through. Ron, for the listeners, the viewers who'd like to pick up their own copy of the book, where can they go to find out more?
Well, Lexham Press is the press that has published this, so they could just Google Lexham Press and they could order. The book was, it left the tarmac a couple of weeks ago, and so I'm sure they could get it fairly quick or order through Amazon. There's a variety of means that they could order it. And I would certainly welcome a variety of reviews of the book, pro contra, or post things on Amazon or whatever, because the final word on Peterson is not out. And you know, there are different reads of him, reactions in different directions. And so he's a man in this is another thing I think which attracts a lot of people. He's a man in process, searching, feeling his way. And so for those of a generation that have become cynical, but they long for meaning and purpose, he's someone in which there's a level of cynicism on the one hand, but seeking faith on the other. And he lives in this trying tightrope tension, as anybody will have to on their journey.
Well, like we do with every episode, we'll have detailed links in the show notes, places where you can pick up your own copy of the book. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Ron Dart. Once again, our book today was Myth and Meaning in Jordan Peterson, A Christian Perspective. Again, if you'd like to find out more about this and other great books published by Lexham Press, you can head on over to their website at lexhampress.com. And Ron, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Oh, it's been a delight to be with you.